Today we're going to look at two amazing English swords of the 17th century. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and I'm here at Olympia Auctions because they've got a sale coming up on the 25th and 26th of June. So check out the catalogue down below where you can see all of the amazing things that they've got in this auction. Now, I've picked out two swords here to feature in this video because they are sort of related in that they are both English and they both date to about 1620 to 1640. So both of these could have been present in the English Civil War, and in fact, given the number of people engaged in the English Civil War, there's a fair likelihood that they were actually there and they did actually see that. Now, the first thing we have to say is that at this time there are a whole different bunch of swords in use for different purposes, both on the battlefield and off of it. So if we take someone like Oliver Cromwell, for example, a rather famous character from history, we know that he had a whole bunch of swords. So obviously he was at the top of the food chain, so he had lots of money, lots of resources, lots of different, armors and uniforms and everything else. So he would have had different swords for different occasions. And in fact, we know that sometimes he had a rapier and sometimes he had a basket-hilted sword. Now, in fact, one of his basket-hilted swords, and not this type of sword, we'll talk about this in a second, is actually in the V&A, the Victoria and Albert Museum. And there are others around there in the world as well that allegedly are associated with Oliver Cromwell. But fundamentally, what's represented here are the two types of sword, which in England, in the late 16th and early 17th century, had become almost enemies and opponents of each other. And this is really typified in George Silver's treatises of 1599 and probably about 1602. Very famously, and George Silver often gets quoted, but equally if we look at someone like Joseph Swetnam from 1617, these are the two main types of sword in use in England, or indeed in a lot of other northern European countries at this time. One is known either as a backsword or a broadsword. We'll unpack that term in a second. So a backsword or a broadsword primarily seen as a cutting sword, or a rapier primarily seen as a thrusting sword. Now, before we get into the whole cutting and thrusting debate, let's just dispel a few myths very quickly. Rapiers can usually cut. Not all rapiers can, because some have got like triangular blades and stuff, but most rapiers have some level of cutting capacity, but they are very specialized towards the use of the point, and this is even shown in the designs of their hilts and where they protect. Whereas the backsword or broadsword, we'll talk about that term in a second, are primarily cutting swords that can also thrust, but they're never going to be as adept at thrusting as something like a rapier, partly because they're shorter, so they can't reach as far, but partly also because of the shapes of the tips. You can see here that the rapier has a long, narrow tip that will go straight through clothes and bodies, and the broader point here, while it might do more damage, will struggle to get through thicker clothing, for example. Now, some people have asserted that these are seen more as battlefield swords or war swords, while rapiers are seen more as civilian, courtly, dueling swords. That's a tricky topic, so I don't want to completely throw it out of the window because there is some element of truth to that. I think there is a lot of evidence that people who wore in the street, as it were, they wore rapiers, sometimes switched, or very often switched, to using things like this backsword here in military life. So I think as a general tendency it's true, but it's in no way an absolute. And we categorically know that rapiers were absolutely carried on the battlefield. In some cases, pikemen were specifically armed with short rapiers by regulation. So we absolutely know that rapiers were used on the battlefield, and some people chose, even on horseback, to use rapiers rather than these. But it just seems that at least it was commonly viewed that these were slightly more like war swords and these were slightly more civilian or courtly swords. But obviously also within this kind of sphere of rapiers, not all rapiers are the same. Some have got broader blades, some have got shorter blades, some have got different, more simpler types of hilt. So it's a very complicated topic. Right, now let's just briefly talk about each one of these swords in turn. So what we have here is a classic example, and a very nice one I have to say, of an English mortuary hilted sword. So why is it called that? We have talked about this in previous videos, hopefully you remember, but for those of you who haven't seen those videos, they've got little faces on them, and these are supposedly, some people say these are related to the executed Charles I. The problem is we have examples which predate his execution, so that doesn't necessarily add up at all. In fact, this example probably predates that. So that doesn't really work out. We don't exactly know who the face is and who the people on these hilts represent. But anyway, in the modern world, these are known as mortuary hilted swords, and they are a very, very characteristically English design of hilt. They are typified by a large bowl plate protecting the front of the hand if you point the point forward, perforated usually, but the early ones aren't necessarily that perforated, but a large plate, and then it essentially has a knuckle bow coming up from the plate to screwed into the pommel, and the screws are a typically English thing as well. So knuckle bow coming up here, screwed into the front of the pommel. Then, and not with all mortuary hilts, but with a lot of them, with the classic design, sidebars like the knuckle bows coming up each side and screwed into the pommel on each side. And then connecting the front knuckle bow with the side knuckle bows, or not really knuckle, side bows, if we call them that, you've got like ribs. So I always think that this looks a little bit like a rib cage, okay? So you've got this central sternum and then the ribs coming out round the side, okay? That does mean if you look at the bottom of the mortuary hilt, you've got essentially 90-degree angle between each of those, so it completely fills 180 degrees of the front of the hand. So the back half is open, the front half is sort of closed. And sometimes these had a lining inside, sometimes a buff leather lining or fabric or other things like that. So sometimes the gaps would be filled as well. But obviously primarily this is to protect against incoming cuts as you are using it as a predominantly cutting implement. But the nice thing is against something like a rapier, for example, if you are using it point forward, you've actually got absolutely phenomenal protection to the front of the hand, which might possibly indicate how they were often used as cavalry swords. Because if you're on horseback and riding with the point forward from any angle, any incoming points are going to be completely stopped by that steel basket in there. So it's a really, really good hilt design. One slight drawback of it, which is kind of mitigated with later designs of sword, which we'll look at in the future, is that if you try to hold this too much like a saber with a canted hand, that sidebar at the side does conflict with the back of the hand and get in the way a bit. And finally and briefly, because I mentioned it several times, backsword versus broadsword. This is a slightly problematic term. In the modern world, in the modern arms and armour and militaria world, we would say a backsword is single edged, so this is blunt all the way up here, it has a false edge up at the top, and it only has the main cutting edge down the front. Whereas a broadsword in modern terminology would be double-edged. However, it's not so simple as that in period, and sometimes we see things referred to as broadswords because they're broad, regardless of whether they've got one or two edges. Backsword equally comes to become a sort of colloquialism for a cut and thrust sword. So sometimes, whether it's a sabre or a falchion or even a double-edged sword, it's sometimes referred to as a backsword. And backswording is the activity of using one, or a single stick as well. So it all gets very convoluted and complicated. And just to throw another complication into the mix, if we take sort of this early 1600s period, sometimes these were referred to as short swords, even though they're not especially short, but they're shorter than most rapiers. So sometimes these were referred to as short swords just because they're shorter than a rapier. So there we have it, an absolutely beautiful example of the classic English mortuary hilted sword, probably from about 1630, could be 1640, and many of these were used in the English Civil War. And just before we move on to the rapier, I'll mention one thing very briefly. We'll do a deep dive in a future video. Here it says Andrea Ferrara, okay, and that's a legendary sword maker. But the vast majority of blades which bear the name Andrea Ferrara were not made by Andrea Ferrara, or indeed even made by the workshop of Andrea Ferrara, because it became such a prestigious name that we find it on blades throughout Europe. But in England and Scotland, it was a sign of prestige to have Andrea Ferrara engraved on your blade, and indeed if it was a real Andrea Ferrara blade, then that was seen as the absolute Rolls-Royce gold star quality. So now let's look at this rapier, and this is absolutely gorgeous. I adore this rapier. It feels amazing in the hand. Not to say the Mortuary hilt doesn't also, it does, but there's more, I would say there's more variation between rapiers, and this is particularly sweetly handling. Before I go into some sort of stats and finer details, I'll just say one thing, and that is that some of these rapiers prefer to be held in different ways. And so the ways of holding rapiers at this time were varied, and it could vary by individual. So the way that I like to hold this rapier might be different to how you might find you like to hold it. And I personally find that actually this is most nicely gripped with a conventional one index finger over the front quillon grip. And it balances absolutely beautifully there. Right, so you'll want to know how long this is, I'm sure, because we often talk about length when we're talking about rapiers. So to the quillon, which is where I measure rapier blades to, because that's functionally the blade reach from the guard, it is 43 inches. Okay, so it's not humongously long, but it's definitely not short either. It's probably just above average, I would say, 43-inch blade. And this blade is absolutely gorgeous. It's actually a flattened hexagon section. I don't know how well you'll be able to see on screen. I think you can probably see okay. But one detail is the edge bevels, which are single edge bevels, no secondary bevel in sight here, folks. That edge bevel is actually in itself hollow ground, which obviously reduces mass, reduces weight, while retaining stiffness. So this is a hugely responsive blade. When you hold it, it feels a lot more rigid than you expect, because it feels really light, but it feels light because of the hollow grinding, and the point goes absolutely wherever you want it to go. In terms of the hilt, this particular style of hilt is classically English, and there's no questioning that this is an English rapier of about 1620 to 1640. So we're covering the period of the Three Musketeers here, all the way through to Oliver Cromwell and the English Civil War. So a hugely historically romantic period, or fascinating period as well. And it is an iron or steel hilt with damascene, gold damascene on it. And this is not something we see a huge amount on European arms. We're very used to seeing it on Indian tulwars, for example. But we've got gold damascene all over the pommel, all over the guard, knuckle bow, quillons. Obviously a lot of it has come off, but considering that this is a sword which is about 400 years old, it's doing pretty well. It's still got quite a lot of the gilding on there, so absolutely gorgeous. And it's also it's a symmetrical hilt as well, and that's actually not that common. Usually we find some degree of symmetry. Even if the design is the same on both sides, usually they're made for right-handed people, so the guard will project slightly more on the right-hand side than the left-hand side. But this is a truly symmetrical guard, which means that you could hold it left-handed or right-handed and it makes no difference. The only possible thing is you could say that quillon bends one direction, but I don't know if that bend is original because the rear quillon is straight. So who knows? Sometimes you can tell if something's left or right-handed because of the direction that the quillons turn in. So traditionally the front quillon will usually turn inwards and the rear quillon will turn outwards. If that bend is original, that might suggest this is a left-handed rapier because it's curling that way, but who knows? I think the bend has happened during its subsequent life. One detail I want to make clear about this rapier is one of the most beautiful things that when you interact with it is actually the grip. And very often you find grips are cylindrical, and that means that the sword can turn in your hand. Obviously, if you can index the edges, it helps with cutting. Now, not that that's a massive concern with this type of blade. It's a pretty narrow blade, and yes, okay, you'll get a nasty slash with it across someone's shins or face, but you're not going to be hacking through clothes with this. It just won't be able to do it. However, the fact that you can feel the alignment in your hand and the edge is perfectly indexed with that grip, to me, is is a thing of beauty, is something I really, really love. And it's obviously a wire-bound grip, and with fluting in it as well. And so the fact that you've got that fluting and it's much thinner in that plane than in that plane makes it extremely pleasant to grip. Another detail as well you might not get from just looking at pictures, these pommels are not normally cylindrical, as indeed this isn't. It's actually flattened. So we've got a flattened grip and a flattened pommel. It's a very, very pleasant thing. A good thing about having a flattened pommel, incidentally, is it rides past the heel of your hand more comfortably. If it was wider, then it would sort of rub against your hand more. So particularly with a rapier where you're standing in quite extended grips, having a pommel that sits flush against the inside of your hand or wrist is really a great thing. So there we go, two absolutely gorgeous English, yes, I'm being a little bit patriotic here, English swords of the early to mid 1600s. So really covering again the period of the Three Musketeers, obviously they're fictional ones in the stories anyway, and you know, the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell, and all of that kind of stuff. So fascinating period. Beautiful swords, what a joy to hold these were. Both absolutely lovely, and also these, as mentioned, these could be owned by the same person, and that person might, when operating as cavalry, might use this sword, and when walking about town and defending their lives in the streets might wear this sword. So both fighting weapons, but for slightly different purposes, probably most of the time. Anyway, thanks a lot to Olympia Auctions for hosting me. Check out the catalogue down below, their sale on the 25th and the 26th of June, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks.